I mean, can you play the clip in 2012 and 13 when it was at 200 and everybody was laughing at me on CNBC every time I would talk about Bitcoin? Where is it going? It's probably going to 100, then 150, then 200,000. In what period? I don't know. 5 years, 10 years, but it's going there. And the reason is because every time you see all of this stuff happening, it just reminds you that, wow, our leaders are not as trustworthy and reliable as they used to be. And so just in case, we really do need to have some kind of, insurance we can keep under our pillow that gives us some access to an uncorrelated hedge. And it's going to eventually transition to something much more important. But for right now, you're just getting all these data points that prove this thing. It's just the fabric of society is frayed. And until we figure out how to make it better, it's time to just have a little schmuck insurance on the side. And everybody's running in. It's just an incredible thing. I could never have imagined it.
Good to be a schmuck, I guess, if you got.
Hey freaks, it's your boy Matt Odell. Sorry about that little technical mishap we had there. Thank you for joining us on the rebroadcast. This is Citadel Dispatch episode 4. I'm joined by my friends Janine and benthecarman. I'd like to welcome them here to the show. I want to thank all the freaks for joining us live. Without you, we couldn't do this show. And it's been a pretty crazy week. So the topics I want to cover, mostly the focus I really want to have here is on censorship, privacy, and open source software, because I think these last few weeks have really highlighted to a lot of people what the three of us have been talking about a lot lately, which is the need for more censorship resistant tools and platforms available to individuals. So with that being said, let's get this party started. Janine, do you want to give a brief intro on how the freaks, what your focus has been in the last few years?
Yeah, hi everyone. For anyone who doesn't know me, I'm an investigative journalist and privacy researcher. Middle of last year, I started a newsletter called This Month in Bitcoin Privacy. So if you want to specifically know about anything related to privacy in Bitcoin, that's what I focus on. I also do other work, but that's mainly the Bitcoin stuff. I also have a shout out to John Spahari for reminding me. Worked on wallets recovery with I just my brain is a bit dead right now. Yeah, worked on wallets recovery, which helps with which helps with if you have issues like importing your keys or your seed to other wallets and are struggling with that. It kind of explains why that's the case and which wallets are compatible with each other.
That's great. And no, don't worry about being a little frazzled here. I think we all are after my little technical issue there. Ben, how should people know you?
Hey guys, I'm Ben. I've been in Bitcoin for like 3 years now, and I've been doing Bitcoin development for about 2 years-ish now. Started at like Bitcoin Core, just basic stuff, and then worked at Wasabi for a while, and then for the past year, I've been at SuredBits doing discrete log contract stuff.
Thank you for introducing yourself. I just put the link to This Month in Bitcoin Privacy, Janine's most recent newsletter, into the comments. Everyone should go check that out. I really have been enjoying them, so thank you for that, Janine. I guess let's just jump right into it. we had the sitting president of the United States got removed from Twitter completely forever. And I think all of a sudden people are starting to realize that if it can happen to one of the most powerful people in the world, then maybe it is actually happening to much more vulnerable people all the time. And I think I think it would be good to shed some light on what this particular issue is. This idea of deplatforming, this idea that you can basically remove someone from an online platform, and what are the implications of that for us going forward?
Yeah, it's been a real crazy week because it wasn't just like the president; it was like lots of other things. Like Ron Paul's like page got removed off Facebook, and like some even some like stuff from the left got removed that like seemingly was unrelated to Trump. So it's been like a huge purge from social media, and it's like, I don't know. I think like Gab and like Mastodon have been getting huge influxes, which is good to see.
So, the issue is bigger, I think, than so. I'm gonna how can we unpack this? Let's unpack this a little bit, because we literally had Parler, right, which is one of these competing Twitter like services. I guess it was a relatively new service. It had, it was a very amateur hour type of operation they seemed to be having over there. They didn't have very good security policies in place. But besides all of that, Amazon AWS removed Parler from their service. They deplatformed them from the actual cloud servers. Amazon's cloud servers are running a large majority of the internet. And Parler's operations were part of that, and they removed Parler from there. And then before that happened, Apple and Google removed them from the App Store. So we have multiple different things happening, right? We have like platforms on platforms on platforms, right? So like so you have the individual user who is being hosted on a platform. You have that platform, which is then also is being hosted on a cloud server somewhere. And then you have the actual app distribution, which is going through these controlled walled gardens. And wherever you have the central point of failures is where you tend to see pressure happen. So let's unpack it even further than that. Janine, now she's no longer having cat problems. Janine, why is free speech important? Why is the ability for anyone to interact freely online so important?
Yeah, just to insert really quickly, I blanked on Rodolfo Novak's name because I was staring at my cat about to push something off of a bookshelf. So that is fixed now. But yeah, so I actually gave a talk in December called Financial Cancel Culture about the link between freedom of speech and money, and how censoring financial access and also just limiting financial access in general can affect speech. And so, yeah, I definitely think that in terms of recent events, but also, I mean, I covered mainly events that happened just in November and December in my presentation, and there was quite a lot. I focused on that because there was just so many examples that I could give. Obviously, the most prominent one that most people know about is when WikiLeaks published the diplomatic cables, and then you had various payment processors and even banks kicking them off, not for any real explicit reason in most cases, and not saying no whether there was any pressure, but I think it's reasonable to assume that there was pressure at a very high level to do so. But even if there wasn't, without Bitcoin existing, I think I could reasonably say that WikiLeaks itself may not have continued to exist after that point. Or at least it would have been significantly harder, because at the moment, I think they're still relying on basically other institutions to accept donations on their behalf, which, that works, but it's not the best. So in terms of journalism, which is my focus, I definitely see the value in having a money that is censorship resistant, because like WikiLeaks and a lot of other people now are skilled in finding ways to at least make their platform censorship resistant. There's a lot of different methods for that don't have anything to do with blockchains, despite many attempts at that in recent years. But a lot of them haven't really looked at money. And I think, examples like WikiLeaks, but also others, they're the only people who have really considered that and actually been willing to experiment with things like Bitcoin, which is, back in 2010 was so much smaller. And that was, it's always this rumor that part of the reason that Satoshi went quiet is because one of the last messages he or they posted was about the hornet's nest being kicked in terms of WikiLeaks possibly accepting donations in Bitcoin. And weirdly enough, I still think that a lot of Bitcoiners have that fear of even talking about the case or trying to link Bitcoin with that in any way, which is unfortunate, because I feel like, if one organization, if you can't even talk about an organization accepting Bitcoin, is Bitcoin really censorship resistant? If you're afraid about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an excellent point, and you touched on something that is really key there. I mean, for us as Bitcoiners, which is that oftentimes the financial aspects are what gets squeezed first, and if you're able to defund a particular movement, you're able to prevent them from raising funds. You're able to prevent maybe a independent media personality or individual from monetizing their work, then you're able to essentially censor their speech, even if you're not stopping the specific speech, because you're making it so that they're not able to fundraise, they're not able to support their operations. But this is a phenomenon that we've seen growing more and more over the years. I mean, most recently, I think a big element of the financial censorship side has been, I think it was called Operation Choke Point, which was against, I believe, sex workers and marijuana businesses. And these type of businesses are and you see the trend here, right? The trend is you basically put a business or an entity in a bad light. You equate WikiLeaks with terrorism or foreign governments. You equate marijuana and sex working with illegal, distasteful activities, and then it's easier for you to go and censor them. And that's exactly the MO we've seen on these speech platforms. So it comes down to, what is the solution here? As our lives get more and more digital, and is that solution really, as some have said, like competing platforms, right? So if Stripe censors you, well, do you go to Cash App? Or if Twitter censors you, do you go to a Gap? Alternatively, we've seen that because of the way our tech situation is set up, our tech infrastructure is set up, there's so many choke points that prevent those companies from even competing in the first place. So I would argue, and I think you guys would tend to agree with me, that the real solution here is some type of tech-based solution. We basically need networks and protocols and tools that can't be censored by an individual, whether you like it or not. And that's the only real way to protect speech and to tangentially to protect privacy, I would say, is the same thing. Ben, what are your thoughts here?
I completely agree. Like, I mean, I think like this week kind of proved how much like competing platforms like isn't really the solution, because like, I mean, there's like that picture from like Fox News of like 20 different platforms that banned Trump, and then like we saw like the actual Twitter platforms, like Parler, like it got delisted from both app stores, and AWS stopped hosting them. So like, I mean, you can try to create a separate platform, but it's still another central point of failure that you're relying on. It's just a different central point of failure. So like building a actual decentralized alternative where you actually have like censorship resistance and not just relying on some other party is a much better alternative. And I think people are recognizing that a lot more now, and there's hopefully some people are waking up and realizing we need to build these like censorship resistant platforms or protocols for things like other than money.
So I think like an interesting way of framing it is this idea, like when you see this censorship coming from a central body, it tends to be, the playbook tends to be to do two things: to identify critical participants and then pressure those participants. So I think when you're looking at tools that are trying to help further the goals of censorship resistance, I think like the two main things that we can benefit from is making it more difficult to identify the specific participants. And even if you do identify the participants, make it so each participant doesn't have, any kind of real significant power over the others. Otherwise, you can find one and you can pressure them. And so a key element here is free open source software, because if we do not have free open source software, then you always have some kind of centralized company sitting here and operating whatever tool you're using, such as Twitter, and that company can get pressured. I was hoping, Janine, that you could help enlighten the freaks, why open source is so much more powerful, and why it's basically a absolutely essential for us moving forward. Or if you disagree with me.
Well, one thing I thought was interesting, I don't know if you guys looked at the notice that BitGo received that, they had basically violated US sanctions because they had supposedly hosted wallets for users that were connecting from the banned countries like Iran and Syria and such. I thought that was interesting because that happened around, or that notice was published within days of a similar notice that was in the complete opposite direction from GitHub, which, for anyone who didn't see, in 2019, there was this controversy because GitHub was suddenly limiting access to developers from Iran, and they were citing US sanctions as the reason. And interestingly, I can't remember the date when it was posted, it was the last week or so, but they posted an update saying that they had actually applied for a license to be able to offer their services in Iran. And the argument that they gave was that they basically said that the freedom of information benefits of making their services available for developers there it was greater than the need to basically deny it on the basis of imposing economic sanctions, which I thought was really interesting because basically it was saying, the value of, offering these services and having people from Iran contribute to open source software was outweighed, or it outweighed the desire for the government to restrict that. So I thought that was interesting that those two things happened at the same time, even though they went in completely opposite directions.
Right, with GitHub, they actually got approved, right?
Yeah,
So
their license got approved, and they say that they're going to apply for licenses for other countries. At the moment, they just have Iran. But yeah, it's unfortunate that the same argument can't also be made for money, but obviously money is perceived as much more political than simply software hosting, unfortunately. But I would argue
you were
that
surprised,
they're
right?
very similar. I was surprised about BitGo, or I was surprised about GitHub.
No, BitGo, what didn't surprise me, we can get back to that, but the reversal on GitHub allowing Iranians, I mean, I was pleasantly surprised at that, but I don't think that's something that we can really expect going forward, right? Like, it caught me off guard.
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't expecting it. I mean, because as everyone should know by now, GitHub is owned by Microsoft. So I'm guessing that the reason they were able to do that was maybe Microsoft stuck its giant foot in there and said that they wanted to support it. I have no idea what stance Microsoft may have taken in those kinds of negotiations, but I mean, it is good that that argument that they made was successful. Because I didn't even know that. I wasn't even aware that you could actually apply for a license to basically ignore the sanctions under certain circumstances. But I was surprised that it sounds like they made the argument that it's important for spreading intellectual freedom or something.
No, yeah, I mean, 100% great to see that. You do have a good point there that it kind of hits both ways, right? These big companies, it's more likely in some ways it's more likely that they can, bend the rules in their favor, and get a carve out for themselves for Iranian users in this case. But then other times, they're almost bigger targets, and they'll be more likely to have to comply because they are one of the largest companies in the world, and the governments have more leverage over them. Like sometimes you see like these smaller, a lot of times you'll see like these smaller startups and they might not do any kind of geo blocking. And then once they get bigger, then they have to. Just to go back to BitGo, that's really interesting because what we're seeing here is basically it was a non-custodial wallet with BitGo. It was a non-custodial Bitcoin wallet. They weren't holding anyone's Bitcoin, but they were providing infrastructure. And so they knew the IP addresses of their users. And one of the issues is using IP addresses to mass classify users is that you can use a VPN to, fake an IP address or have a different IP address located in a different country. So what happens after that is what we usually see is justification of KYC, which is mass data collection of users to make sure that the user is who they say they are and to censor appropriately. Ben, you've been awfully quiet over there. You want to talk to the freaks a little bit about why why KYC concerns us so much?
And it says like KYC is like it's a double-edged sword where like one, you're like you're giving up this info that now you don't want to give up. Like if you're just giving this info to BitGo or whatever, like they can use this information against you, and like you shouldn't need to do that. It's a huge hassle, and you're like putting yourself up for like risk because like we've seen countless times where BitGo could get hacked, and now they're selling this data on the market, like what we saw with Ledger earlier this like a few months ago, where now like there's just a huge entire database of people that own Bitcoin, and they have their house address and phone number and full name, and like if you had something like that, or if you're doing even full KYC, we're giving up something like a driver's license or a social security number, now you can be at risk for like someone stealing your identity, and then someone could open up credit cards in your name and like really screw things up. And like it's a huge problem in America. I think like a quarter of Americans get their identity stolen in their lifetime, which is utterly ridiculous. And like that's thousands of hours that people are spending not only like getting wasted by like having to deal with that, but then like if they don't catch it, they could actually like ruin parts of people's lives. And like these people have no reason to be able to give up this information. Like I should be allowed to use BitGo's services if me and BitGo want to use it, but some people don't like that.
Yeah, I think there's kind of two aspects to KYC that are harmful. The one aspect is for people who even have information relevant to KYC to begin with, which is that once you enter that, as you said, you're at risk of identity theft. You're at risk of things like the Ledger data breach happening, where potentially thousands to hundreds of thousands of people, if they didn't use if they didn't obfuscate their identity somehow or obfuscate their shipping location, whether that's a in a lot of cases it was probably a home address, then you basically open yourself up to anyone with the motivation to come and find you with the knowledge that, you know, you have some interest at least in a volatile asset. The other aspect of KYC is that from the start, it blocks out anyone who doesn't have the identity documents necessary to participate in the system by going through the KYC process. Like, if they don't have it, they don't even get the choice of whether to participate, because whether to make that take those privacy risks. They just don't have the option. So that's also an issue. And so, you know, on one hand, that means, you know, you're, you know, financially censored in the sense, and your speech in effect can be censored as well if you're not even allowed to join these platforms because you don't have the right documents. But then also you can be censored if you say something that is not acceptable to that platform and they don't want to host it anymore and they kick you off.
Yeah, like that, it's like a huge deal where like now, like say if I don't know, if you're a sex worker and you have to, and you want to use like someone's service, like if I'm like want to have a wallet at Bitco, it shouldn't matter like what my job is, like, but if you have to like submit an ID, they could like do some cross check and be like, oh, this person does this job that we deem inappropriate, and now they block you from the service, which like they shouldn't be, like they shouldn't have to know who I am, and like they shouldn't need to be able to do all that stuff. Like it'd be so much better for like both parties if they could just ignore that and just like offer the service anonymously.
Well, I mean, that's the thing, right? Is like all these arguments are made that it's to protect the users, or at least we often hear that. But ultimately, this data collection is ineffective because criminals can buy KYC information, fake information. They can steal fake information. All that information, usually you should assume that it's going to leak because companies have hard time securing that information. So really, it's not only does it put users in massive risk in terms of their private data, but it's not even effective because it creates this loop where that private data is such a honeypot that it can then be used to circumvent any kind of compliance benefits so-called compliance benefits that they could possibly get out of it, that they pretend they can get out of it. Ideally, if we were talking about protecting the user, that service, that company, that tool should know as little as possible about them. Compounding that on top of that, we have a internet model, a monetization model on the internet that is the main monetization model that's gotten widespread use is really the monetization of user data and advertising to them. So, you know, many of our most profitable companies not only are required by regulation to collect intimate data on us, but they actually have an incentive system in place to make money by collecting additional data on top of that. And then I don't even know where to put this, but Americans know about the Equifax leak, which the Equifax hack, where we weren't even customers. They were just a third-party company that just automatically takes data on every single American. So we just have these systems in place that prioritize data collection over data protection, and it just us. So I mean, another thing that's been happening. So I mean, a key element here, I think, is privacy. I think it all comes together. You can't really have proper censorship resistance without privacy, without some elements of privacy, and you can't really. I guess you could get privacy without censorship resistance. Maybe, but I feel like if you have privacy, then you're almost censorship resistant inherently. What do you guys think about that relationship between privacy and censorship resistance?
I'd agree with that. Like, if you don't know who I am, like it's a lot harder to censor me, like based off who it's impossible to censor me based off who I am. Like, you can't, if you don't know what my job is, you can't censor me because I'm a sex worker, because I deal drugs or whatever. So you'll always get that inherent censorship. Now, they could do like extra analysis, but you're still like always enhancing that. And I mean, that's always just gonna be a net benefit.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of if you think of privacy as, if you first do threat modeling and figure out what your threats are in privacy, and because I think that's part of the problem is that, and it's something I'm going to kind of talk about for the Bob meetup, but I can go into the gist here, which is that I kind of am annoyed with the way that a lot of people respond to me when I say I'm researching privacy or I'm a privacy researcher, because usually the first question I get is why does privacy matter? And I think that has to do with the fact that people don't think of privacy as information security. I mean, information security is a lot broader than just privacy. It's also about authentication and integrity. But privacy is a big part of that. And if someone calls themselves a security researcher, you don't see them getting asked, why is security important? And so if people started thinking about privacy as a strategy for security, then I think they would understand that that question is kind of weird to get asked. Because yeah, I definitely think that I think you have to have some privacy in terms of, I actually use the German term, because in Germany, they don't have privacy really in the constitution. They have what's called informational self-determination. And that's the idea that you should be able to decide who has access to your information, or at least have knowledge of who has access. That's actually in their constitution. And I find that a lot better in terms of explaining to people what privacy is, like the scope of it, because if it's about voluntarism and being able to make decisions about who has access to your information and having control over it, then I think people will appreciate privacy a lot more if it's framed in that way, and not just I'm hiding stuff, because that's how most people, I think, see privacy, is that you have to go dark and interact with people in a very limited way. But I think that that's like a narrow section of what I think privacy means.
So I mean that's definitely a very good point that I've struggled with myself, is do people actually, does the average person care enough? I mean, I think the answer is overwhelmingly no. I think ultimately, in our society, we've kind of found ourselves in this weird situation where privacy is actually, the default is the opposite, unfortunately, and that wasn't always the case before. It's mostly tech enabled. Our world has become more and more digital, and I mean, a perfect example is the status quo is, if you spoke in your house about something, it was only heard by like you and your family members and whoever was in the house. Now, for a large number of people around the world, they have internet connected microphones that they plugged in themselves to provide them additional conveniences. So that's not, it's no longer the status quo, right? It's almost the people who are seeking privacy are the outliers. You have to like go out of the way.
Yeah, on that subject, there was a very interesting talk at CCC about, I think it was specifically about Amazon's, no, I think it was Siri actually. And yeah, a lot of people, they kind of see Apple as, I mean, actually the researcher who presented justified her continued use of Siri personally as to say Apple's business model isn't to sell your data. And I would debate that. I would say it's true in the larger context of all the other companies who are doing and creating similar products, but I would definitely recommend watching that because a lot of people think, oh, the Alexa only turns on or is engaged when you give the call phrase like hey Alexa or hey Siri or whatever. And it turns out that's not the case. She actually tested it on her own house and family, and it was getting triggered by like random laughter, random conversation that you couldn't even hear in the recording. So if anyone, I hope no one has those. I would never have one of those devices. But anyone who does, you might want to check that out because it is picking up a lot more than you think it does.
I think what a lot of people don't understand too, it's not like you have your assigned FBI agent listening on your Alexa device. It's like these companies have like some of the smartest people in the world working on like data collection and data analysis. So like your Alexa is just like streaming some data to the Amazon servers, and it's going through this complex thing they wrote that's doing an analysis, and that's where you're like losing like privacy and other aspects like that. It's not like even if like quote unquote the government doesn't care about you, like you're still losing something here, and like it's still something you should be protecting. That like Amazon doesn't need this data from you, and you have no reason to give it to them.
So, I mean, there's a good point there in terms of Amazon telling individuals that it's only collecting information under a specific set of circumstances. That brings us back to the open source software conversation, in that we can have tools at our disposal that allow us to easily prove and verify that they're doing what they're doing. Unfortunately, the status quo is the exact opposite. I mean, you said there that Siri, Apple says they protect my privacy, and it's their business model to protect my privacy. There is no way that any of us can prove that or verify that.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, a big reason of why those kinds of devices concern me is if anyone's not familiar with kind of the U.S. Statute, there's a principle called the third party doctrine that I've especially been following a lot in my newsletter when it comes to like the EFF looking at the lack of privacy protection and transparency with fintech apps, including some that have to do with cryptocurrency. And the third party doctrine in the US basically says that if you give data to a third party, that could be your friend, it could be a business, but in general, it gets applied to instances with businesses, basically says that if you give your data to a third party, you have a decreased or in some cases no expectation of privacy anymore because you've like surrendered that privacy to someone else. And so what scares me about, I haven't seen whether this has been applied anywhere, but I am afraid of the idea that if you have these devices in your house, that at some point someone's going to make the argument that because you have, surrendered the privacy of your conversations in your own home and other people can access that decreases your, there's this assumption that within the home there is, it's different on like public streets and such, but in the home that is considered like the gold standard of places where you should expect to have privacy. And so if that is then stripped away, what other place is there anymore?
Yeah, I mean, you could take that argument pretty much all the way down, right? Especially now that we have so much of our lives are connected to the internet all the time. I mean, most people are walking around with a phone in their pocket. They have Apple Watches. As we said, they have these voice assistants. When you're walking down the street, there's cameras everywhere. So yeah, the status quo is lack of privacy, and you basically have to seek it out. And I think that is one of the many issues that we have in terms of a society that's trying to be a beacon of free speech and a beacon of personal rights. I think we've ended up very far from that, and there's a lot of progress that needs to be made there. I wanted to cover this recent these So we have free open source software allows us to verify that that these tools are doing what they say they're doing. We have individuals that need to actually care to use those tools. And then we have the overwhelming set of individuals that don't realize. And I think ultimately what happens is as we see our society become more and more anti-privacy by design, is people are going to get burned, right? And we're going to see worse and worse data leaks. Like, I think if you look at the scale of instances we've had and leaks we've had and hacks we've had, and privacy compromises, we've had massive privacy compromises. It gets worse and worse as the years go by, because just by design, there's more information available out there. You know, the Ring camera system that Amazon has in front of everyone's house is a relatively new device in terms of network effects. Yet now you're starting to see it all throughout the suburbs in America. What happens when those cameras start, the implications of stuff like those cameras. And I think what happens is people will get burned. And then once they get burned, it's up to us as privacy advocates. It's up to us to have those tools ready for them and the education ready for them, so that when they're a motivated individual, they can improve their own situation. Would you guys agree with that?
I completely agree with that. It's also like in a kind of an incentive problem too of creating these open source solutions, because, you know, as an open source developer, you're generally not getting paid to do that, and you know, Amazon's just going to hire thousands of people to create a better product. So like, it really does have to come from like the actual user to want to seek the privacy, because like the open source solution won't probably be the better product initially, because, you know, they don't have multi-million-dollar companies behind them.
Any thoughts there, Janine?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think, because on this subject, I actually have been reading a book called The Making and Maintenance of Open Source Software by Nadia Agbal. I haven't finished it yet, so I can't do a review, but I was generally really excited about it because basically she studied how open source communities function and how open source software is built. And one of the things that she starts off with at the beginning is kind of dispelling the notion that, like, yes, open source software, ideally, anyone can contribute anytime. It has like a wide contributor base, but in practice, she actually split up. She kind of defined like the different types of projects that you can have based on some having like really high user growth versus very low contributor growth. So you don't have tons of contributors for most open source projects. They have very few contributors. In some cases, only one. But then some of them can have a really high user base. And so, I mean, in Bitcoin, I think we're especially sensitive to that because we have we care about consensus and about who's able to make changes to the code. And so Bitcoin is actually mentioned, I think, at least once in the book as an example that it's a community that cares very highly about like the quality of the code and the security of, who is able to make contributions. And so part of that problem where we kind of have, over the years, we've kind of seen open source software development as a commons and something that's just there and available. And I mean, part of the reason why I think there aren't as many contributors to each project is because a lot of these people are just contributing their free time. And they do that because I don't think it's so much that in some cases, maybe there aren't people who want to fund them, but I think in a lot of cases, it's just the barriers to funding contributors in a way that makes sense had not really been possible until Bitcoin. And so I definitely think stuff to get developers funded and even exploring different ways of like, how much should you give to particular contributors? Is the maintainer getting all of it and then they distribute it? or are you paying on like a per commit basis? I think that's going to be really interesting in the future if open source projects can get funded, because we've broken down the kind of onboarding hurdles to doing so. Because I think people want to, it's just a struggle in a lot of cases to figure out how to do that. Like I myself, at the moment, I don't have any public facing funding options. I'm trying to fix that. But it is a lot of people, they just set up like a Cash App profile or something. There's a lot of user experience. There's a lot of money being put into user experience lately with those kinds of things by big companies. The problem is, these are essentially still bank accounts. So the people who can access them still have to go through the regular KYC process to do it. And so in that way, that still limits who can then get funded for contributing. So that would be unfortunate. But with Bitcoin, we can do better than that.
I mean, those are some interesting points there. In terms of getting funding, a key aspect of Bitcoin is that it enables developers who are unknown developers who do not have their legal government identity publicly attached with working with this open source project, are able to receive funding. We've seen multiple developers get funded from Square Crypto, for instance, that are NIMs that are located around the world. So that is a new opening, which is really good to see, because we were talking about earlier the relationship between censorship resistance and privacy. I think it's extremely important that we have developers on important projects like Bitcoin that do not have their public identity associated with it. It becomes a lot more difficult to pressure them and to stop working on that kind of code, especially in situations where that code could get politically heated. I feel like this is a good moment to kind of discuss this apparent Tor attack that we see happening, because Tor is considered, one of the leading open source projects, I would argue. And it seems to me that there's almost a completely different mentality in terms of adversarial mindset versus the Bitcoin project, the Bitcoin open source project. Is that something that you've noticed, Ben? Like, do you? I feel like people grossly underestimate basically the mindset that's gone into the motivation that's gone into developing Bitcoin, the software.
Yeah, I think like a lot of people like kind of just assume Tor is a thing that will always work, and it's not something that needs to be defended. Like we like all agree we need to defend Bitcoin, but like, and this week we kind of saw like all like V3 Tor addresses were down, and like tons of like services rely on that. And like you were commenting this on somewhere, it was saying like, this could severely affect the Lightning Network and stuff like that. So yeah, like I think like hopefully this is like a wake up period for people. Like, Tor is just as like probably as important as Bitcoin, and like this is a network we need to defend. And hopefully, maybe this could incentivize people to like fund Tor devs or to contribute themselves. But yeah, it's pretty scary to see like how big of an attack it seemed to be. And I know they said they have a fix, but I don't even know if it's out yet. And it's been like 2 or 3 days now. So like it's been a pretty serious attack.
Yeah, I mean, I've been following the developments of V3 just from a Bitcoin standpoint in my newsletter, because V3, I believe, is going to be added in the next major release of Bitcoin Core instead of V2.
Yeah, that's right.
So I've been following, yeah, and yeah, I haven't looked too much into this recent problem with it. I did notice it was happening because on the day that it supposedly started, I am a Tor user. I am around Tor users, and so there was issues with Tor, and we noticed that immediately. But yeah, I haven't looked into the details. As far as I saw, it was just an implementation bug. But yeah, I mean, part of that is like, I mean, supposedly, you know, also Bitcoin Core developers were looking at it, but that is, you know, scary that something a lot of people depend on for just privacy in general, and then in Bitcoin financial privacy, that would be really bad if there was an issue that suddenly took that down.
I mean, so just, I mean, a base overview is there was a bug that they appear to have, you know, narrowed down what the bug was. I mean, the question is, was it getting intentionally exploited by an attacker to bring down V3 services, or was it just unintentionally done, right? And I think in these types of situations, it's probably better to assume an attack than otherwise. At least call it an alleged attack. But one thing that really struck me here is, I mean, these issues have been going on since the 6th of January. I've noticed these issues myself as a Tor user. I'm still noticing them. It's not resolved. At least on my non-scientific usage myself, and I see other people on the internet reporting issues, continuous issues here. And just like the way the messaging was handled, right? Just like the way, and I'm a huge fan of the Tor project, just the way the messaging was handled on their official blog and their official communication channels is just night and day from the Bitcoin project. I can't imagine like radio silence out of Bitcoin developers if there was an ongoing attack for multiple days.
I mean, I think part of it, I mean, I've been following the Tor project outside of Bitcoin for various reasons, and over the years there has definitely been a cultural change, and the number and the type of people who are involved in contributing to Tor has changed a lot. Part of that is because it went from being like when Tor started out, it was just basically a couple of guys who were, you know, doing academic research. And as Tor got more popular and got more attention, and also there was this desire to shift Tor as much as possible away from this image of it's the darknet market browser, because that has been something that has followed Tor for a very long time. And so there was a lot more focus on the interface design, on user experience, and making it really accessible to the everyday person as much as possible, which I think is a good thing in general. But as with any project, when you focus on one thing, that means other things can suffer. And I don't know if that was the case here, but that tends to be the reason for these types of things happening. It doesn't mean it can never happen if there isn't a focus on security and things like that as the primary thing, which I think it is to the greatest extent. But I think that might be part of the reason that this might have gotten missed. In terms of attackers, I mean, Tor is it's a very highly visible project, and there is a lot of incentive for people to break it in comparison to other things. So that's also part of the problem, is that because there are so many vulnerable people who rely on it, there are also attackers who want to break it and hurt those people. So, you know, when things get missed, it can have, even if it's a small thing, it can have a big catastrophic effect compared to other projects that have less visibility.
Yeah, I don't know, like the timing of it too was like very weird too, because like it happened on the same day that like the Capitol was stormed and everything, and followed by, you know, all the deplatforming on various platforms. So, and it could be completely unrelated, but like, and it's kind of weird to see like lots of people getting deplatformed, and then like the private part of the internet getting like attacked at the same time. So like it kind of shows like we do need to fight for these, like no matter what, because if you got deplatformed and now you need to be like using the internet privately for some reason, like you could be, and if Tor's down, you're like totally screwed.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the key similarity we see between the two projects, right? There are these two massive open source projects that basically have to operate in this massive adversarial mindset always, because they're just always constantly. You just have to constantly assume they're under attack. And all I'm saying is I feel like the culture is the culture of the different communities is very important, and it just kind of it's kind of interesting when you compare the Tor culture versus like the Bitcoin culture, just from the more active developers on those projects, especially since there's some like interesting comparisons there. You have the adversarial mindset comparison, but you also have the comparison that you basically have like two different types of users. You and and this is what Janine like kind of touched on, is like this idea that Tor is trying to get away from being the dark market browser, and Bitcoin, a lot of people would say, is trying to get away from being pigeonholed as the dark market currency only. So I mean, there are some similarities there, but at the same time, it just feels like I was surprised that you don't see that much chatter going on in Torland of I mean, you see it on like some of these forums and stuff, but you don't really see it like in their dev community, like that they're worried that it all happened at the kind of the same time. And it's just weird. It's just a weird thing to it was a concern I kind of had, and then to watch it play out just kind of rubbed me the wrong way a little bit. That's all. So, and then the other thing I wanted to touch on was I saw this in the comments, and Freaks, thank you for joining us. Anyone who's here live, thanks to everyone who's listening after the fact as well. This show's all about you guys. We couldn't do it without you. But I saw one of the Freaks mentioned in here, Cloudflare. Do you guys have any strong opinions on Cloudflare?
I have fuck Cloudflare stickers.
Yeah, they've censored people before, and they'll do it again.
So, can we explain what Cloudflare's business is and why it's a concern?
From my understanding, Cloudflare is kind of like a DDoS protection, and then they also do like a bunch of DNS stuff, and just like and then some hosting, I think, as well. And like they're a huge like kind of central point of failure for the internet. Where like I remember like I think it was sometime in 2020, Cloudflare went down, and like half the internet's like sites were down because like they rely on Cloudflare to do stuff like that. So like if you lose service from Cloudflare, you can lose a whole lot of stuff. Or like if you lose your DNS, that could be huge, because now someone needs to actually type in your IP address to find your website. Or if you lose your DDoS protection, your site could go down pretty easily. So I mean, like losing Cloudflare can be a huge thing. And I know the sites that have taken down, they weren't the most upstanding sites. It was like a super like Nazi site or something like they took down. But it's still like, if you don't defend these people, then who are you going to defend when they come for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think the key aspect here is that the internet as we know it has some very integral broken incentives, and is it is not this magic piece of networking that people necessarily think it is in today's age, right? Like people just think it just works. They think it's just like magic. But what really is happening is the way it's set up is it's very easy for a relatively easy for a sophisticated actor to essentially like bomb a site with traffic. And if you bomb a site with traffic, this is what we call a DDoS, a distributed denial of service attack. you basically hit them so hard that they're not able to serve regular customers, and in the process it becomes very expensive to them, so they're constantly serving the attacker. And the attacker could, maybe they're not even, a lot of times the attacker isn't using their own compute, they're using compromised computers to then attack those sites. So what happens is all these independent site owners, and we see it a lot with the Bitcoin exchanges, if we want to bring it back to Bitcoin, rely on the easiest way for them to handle those distributed denial of service is through a centralized actor who's able to basically have massive block lists and distribute any kind of traffic around their global network. They have massive economies of scale that allow them to mitigate these DDoS attacks. But what that means is that's a centralizing incentive. So now we have a few companies that are offering this service, and those companies become central points of failure. And it's kind of tangential to the Tor concerns, because Tor, as a network that prioritizes privacy, inherently has DDoS concerns, because you can't, like if the protocol is working correctly, like you shouldn't be able to block individual users. So and the way Tor handles it is they handle it with these centralized directories, and that's what was getting hit. So usually when we see these protocols, the way they handle distributed denial of service is they handle it via increased centralization. But as we know, that doesn't work if you're facing a massive massive pro-censorship force that has regulatory powers over you. So like in Tor's threat model, they basically assume the U.S. government isn't going to go after them, which has been good so far. It's in the U.S. government's good graces, and we take advantage of that. Bitcoin doesn't have that luxury. So the way Bitcoin handles it is pretty graceful. The way Bitcoin handles it is essentially those transaction fees allow you to mitigate massive spam on the network, which would essentially be like a DDoS on the network. It's very, very it's just slick how that incentive model is set up, and I think people don't realize how massive that is.
Yeah, and on that subject, both Tor and DDoSing, the Tor project is actually exploring using anonymous tokens. And when I say tokens, they did specify that they don't necessarily mean with a blockchain. It could be with something else, but they have indicated, I think since September, that they are exploring using tokens. They kind of hinted at possibly monetizing them, but that is not the main use case. I think I'll get their post. They say additional benefit of a token-based approach is that it opens up a variety of use cases for Tor in the future. For example, in the future, tokens could be used to restrict malicious usage of Tor exit nodes by spam and automated bots, hence reducing exit node censorship by centralized services. Tokens can also be used to register human memorable names for Onion services. That is good. Side note that I think that's going to be a big one, because if you've ever used an Onion service, it's basically a random generated string, and that is not something that's easy to remember without pinning it somehow. Which is kind of hard to do in the Tor browser because it's built to not allow you to do things like that. They can also be used to acquire private bridges and exit nodes for additional security. Lots of details need to be ironed out. So yeah, they are looking at ways within Tor itself of kind of solving that problem to change the incentives.
Yeah, I mean, I think it'll be interesting to see how they play around with those different models, because I think something does need to be done. The incentives need to be, if not a completely different network, but I mean, that's completely above my pay grade. I have a love-hate relationship with Tor where we rely on it all the time, and I support the project. But I think it needs to be more robust, and I hope it becomes more robust over time.
Wasn't there a
Yeah, I mean,
proposal for a network like some like routing, like basically like for a network, but it was using like Lightning Network? I think it came out like in 2019. It was like Mesh 49 or something like that named. I can't remember exactly.
Are you thinking of Lot 49 by Global
Yeah,
Mesh Labs?
yeah, I think so. Yeah, because there was like it was like a basically like a Tor network, but they used like basically like Lightning to incentivize people, to be honest.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the general concept. I mean, I think their focus was more mesh related, but I mean, you can do that kind of that kind of layout on like a non-mesh infrastructure as well. Um, the general idea, I mean, is what we see on the Lightning Network, right? Which is an onion network where the individual nodes are incentivized to route messages, and if you're an attacker, it should come with a cost, right? And that cost is a transaction fee. So then you have an incentive where an attacker it costs more for an attacker than it costs for a good user, and you can reduce the vulnerability to these kind of large scale denial of service attacks. But we'll see how that plays out. Freaks, you got anything else for us in the comments there you want us to touch on? Been really enjoying this conversation. Ben, Janine, you have anything in mind that you think we should touch on here?
well, one thing it was mentioned at the very beginning of the show. Someone brought up RSS, and I just wanted to point out a lot of people don't know that Aaron Schwartz. I'm sure most people know who Aaron Schwartz is, but a lot of people don't know he was actually the creator of RSS and Markdown. Markdown is what Git, and particularly GitHub, although it has its own flavor of Markdown, he was the creator of that. So I just wanted to bring that up because a lot of people don't know that.
I had no idea.
I think something good to bring up was where Mozilla, they were saying like we need more than deplatforming, and like they didn't explicitly say like censor the internet, but they were saying bring up like trustworthy voices or something like that. And like I feel like that's a pretty like kind of scary thing to see. Like I stopped using Firefox after I saw that post where people like I don't know, your browser should be like your gate to the internet. It shouldn't be like telling you what to go on the internet and see. So I think like stuff like that's kind of scary too, where like I think me and a lot of other people I know switched to like ungoogled Chromium, like an actual open source browser, which is good to see, and hopefully that's a good trend we see going forward.
Well, I mean, the browser situation is kind of fucked, right? You mentioned de-googled Chromium, right?
Yeah, that's like it's open source and everything. You can
It's like
compile
basically
it
the
yourself.
only option at this point.
Yeah, and
which
you
is
can't
not
get it on your
ideal.
phone, so you're kind of screwed that way too.
Yeah, so I mean, let's just backtrack here for a second and talk about there's a concept here. There's this idea here that you can selectively filter out only bad content. And I firmly in the camp that in order to protect the most vulnerable amongst us, you have to basically protect everyone in mass, because if you don't, then the powers that be in any individual power relationship will always exert that power and control over the more vulnerable. I both of you agree with that, right?
Yeah, 100%.
I mean, that's the gap, right? That's where the real disagreement is. Would you agree?
I think so. Like like Mozilla and Firefox might have like good intentions today, but 20 years from now they might not, and they could be using this to censor whatever they deem unworthy, which could be like something that we deem perfectly fine, and that's not a good precedent to set. And these people could like very well abuse this power, or even if we trust Mozilla, they could be threatened by a third party, like a government or just a bad actor, and screw over someone that needs to use their browser for some reason, or someone that was relying on that as infrastructure.
Well, I mean, I think us Americans tend to have an American-centric view, but if it's easier for an American, and maybe do the same exercise if you're from another country, to vision a country that you consider has poor human rights. And if you think about a country like China, I think most Americans would agree that we can't trust the Chinese government with choosing who can speak and who can't speak. So if that is the threshold that we agree on, and we agree at that premise, how do we bridge the gap between understanding that as a concept, but thinking that I mean, I think a large amount of the country thinks like a Twitter or an Apple can choose what speech is good speech and what's not. Like, how do we bridge that divide?
Yeah, I mean, I find it really hard to answer that question because on the one hand, I believe in the idea that, if you're a private person or a private company, you're not beholden to, what you're kind of entitled to host or not host, as a government is, obligated to not censor people, at least in countries like the US. But on the other hand, a lot of these big platforms, the reason they are so big is because the state makes it difficult for smaller players to run, their own infrastructure, especially infrastructure that's private and censorship resistant, to any actual meaningful degree. So it's really hard because that's essentially where this kind of public square argument comes in, is because they've effectively been given this kind of cushion by the state because of how they've, because they were either first into the field or because they had enough power from resisting regulatory challenges in different ways to kick out all of the competitors, or at least limit the ability of competitors to get any good user share. I don't know. It kind of makes the question a bit murky to me.
I mean, I kind of feel like the only real solution is, we build and support platforms that no one can easily censor by design, and then we just kind of just wait till enough people get burned to realize that it's an issue. Because I don't know how you get through to people if without them getting burned. Like, if you look at this last week, I think a large amount of people woke up to the issue, and I think it's just kind of getting started. I think as more voices get squeezed, as more people get cut off from the financial system, as more private information gets leaked, people will start to ultimately realize that they need to seek out better solutions.
Yeah, and
I mean,
weirdly enough, apparently Mark Zuckerberg at a conference in 2019 actually said that he believes that the future of social platforms is private, which I find. I mean, he's the kind of person that says a bunch of things that are completely contradictory to the existence of Facebook in so many ways. So but I find it interesting that he said that.
He means perceived privacy, right? And this idea that you can have like a group chat or something, but he doesn't actually mean actual privacy, because that goes against their whole business model. But yeah, so this is actually a perfect example here, right? Is that people have been using WhatsApp for years. Facebook has owned WhatsApp for years. It's the number one chat application, and all of a sudden, people realized. I guess there was like this mass movement recently, like this last week. I guess something changed in their privacy policy, or they had to disclose it because Apple forced them to disclose it. And like a bunch of people woke up, right? And they just switched to Signal. But there's two key elements there, right? Is like the people need to wake up, but then once they wake up, there has to be something that's relatively easy for them to switch to. Waiting.
Yeah, and I think I mean, Oh, you go ahead, Ben.
And the sad thing is too, is like Signal's not even like a perfect solution where now like people might have to be giving up phone numbers of someone they otherwise might have not had to. So like we really do need like alternative solutions, which kind of sucks. But I mean, hopefully people are working on these things now.
Yeah, I've used Signal before. Like I have a general. I don't use it anymore. I have a phone for circumstances where there's no other option, but like it's almost never on. And yeah, I find it as a generally phone-free person. I would say that in general, I would trust Signal a lot more than WhatsApp/Facebook. But at the end of the day, it's the same model. And the model that I'm worried about is the fact that, it's based on this idea that a phone number is an identifier. And I really hate that because phone numbers are not good identifiers. You don't own them. You don't control them, especially if you're in the US. Your phone number can, in most circumstances, so easily be taken away from you just by knowing some small details, and a lot of which is public in a lot of cases. So I'm not a fan of any application that requires a phone number to use it. And in Signal's case, they are trying to get away with it, but so far they are still justifying the requirement of the phone number as a security measure. In fact, they say that it's a way to prevent spam, like their service is getting overwhelmed, or at least that's what they said before. So related to that topic of, yeah.
It's a centralized KYC method of handling a denial of service.
Yeah, well, I don't know if I would call it. It's kind of debatable how much Signal knows. If anyone doesn't know, they store their stuff on Amazon. Yeah, so supposedly the way that Signal has designed their infrastructure, they don't know your phone number explicitly. But still yeah. So that data though is still being stored on Amazon, which I like so much is stored on Amazon. In terms of like centralized adversaries, Amazon's a big one for a number of reasons.
So let's unpack this for a second. Signal is obviously, Ben said it's not perfect. It's clearly not perfect. The two main things is the phone number requirement and just the phone requirement in general. You can't, you can run it on a computer, but you need to have a phone that basically is relaying the messages to the desktop client. It's not a true desktop client. And the phones in general are it's very difficult to secure a phone privacy wise. So you're opening up your users to that risk. But I think it's important to make it it's an important point to make to the freaks that everything has trade-offs. You're never going to see something that's perfect. Signal can get deplatformed from AWS, just like we saw happen to Parler. They haven't though. So if they can get away with a little bit of centralization for additional convenience, then there's an argument to be made there, right? That maybe that trade-off balance is the best balance for a lot of people. Like, if you hear Moxie talk about the phone numbers with Signal's phone number requirement, and he says, for the average user, they find it as a blessing. It's a convenience for them because the average user joins and they just already know which contacts are in Signal. And if you're an Android phone, it basically works like iMessage, right? Where you can use it as your regular text client. And if the other person has Signal, it just automatically switches to Signal rather than SMS. So there's a convenience argument to be made there. And I think this is the type of trade-off balance that we basically see all the time in our day-to-day lives, right?
Yeah, as I think it was a CoinDesk article about cypherpunks, and there was a line in there that said something like, using Signal is the equivalent of like smoking weed once in college in terms of the cypherpunk ethos. Like, it's a good onboard. And I would definitely say I would prefer people using Signal to something like just plain text SMS messages, that's monumentally an improvement. But in terms of censorship resistance, at the end of the day, it's not any different, especially with the requirement of a phone number.
So if we're gonna go full hardo here, right? And you have, if we end up in a situation where the most powerful governments in the world, and the corporations that reside within their jurisdictions, are doing active censorship, right? Specifically Amazon. If Amazon starts deplatforming more privacy focused services such as Signal, we're gonna have to move to something that Bitcoiners know very well, a use your own node model, right? Almost like a personal server, self-host everything kind of model. That is always seemed like the holy grail, to a lot of sovereignty people. But I mean, it comes with a massive convenience trade-off, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think the intermediate stage for something like that would just be, especially if you live around people who have similar interests and needs, then you would have, at least one person who is self-hosting who then provides it for everyone else around. And to answer the question, yeah, so in terms of encrypted messaging apps, I use a lot of different ones, and I use them for different things and also even different people. So I have Keybase. I've had Keybase for a very long time prior to it getting acquired by Zoom last year, I think. I can't remember exactly. And I do
Yeah, it was
definitely think
it was definitely during the pandemic. Go on, continue.
Yeah, so I know I can understand to some degree why they made that decision. I think in terms of the product that they're offering, I think it's like on the completely opposite spectrum to what Zoom has shown that it's interested in terms of privacy. But at least the client, not the server, unfortunately, the server code, but the client for Keybase is still open source. I haven't seen any changes that would indicate something worrying on that end in terms of Zoom putting pressure on them to, even integrate Zoom. I think they said they might do that at some point, but it doesn't look like it was looked on favorably at all. So I am definitely concerned about the fact that Keybase is now owned by Zoom, and that may be a threat. And so I've always, even before that though, I've always treated Keybase as kind of like encrypted Twitter DMs. So like whatever I would relatively feel okay saying in Twitter DMs, I will say in Keybase, and maybe a little more than that, but I don't use it for anything super sensitive. I do think that the fact that, you can control your own key with it, that's independent of Keybase. You can also generate it with Keybase. That is not ideal, but yeah, I think it's all a matter of like, what are the various options? What can you use them for? And what's the threat model in using them? So Keybase, I prefer people to use that rather than DMing me on Twitter, for example, where, Keybase has this whole social network thing. So if someone wants to contact me, it's someone that, if they're following me on Twitter or whatever, then that's already public information. I'm not trying to hide that I'm connected to them or something. So it's just I treat it like an encrypted version of Twitter, sort of. But in terms of like your main app, definitely Keybase is not at the top of the list.
Yeah. So to the freaks listening to this on the podcast feed, one of our freaks, Pedro, he asked Janine what she thought about Keybase, which triggered that discussion right there. I tend to agree 100% with what you said. I think an important thing for the freaks to realize here is that Keybase is open source software. The code could have more eyes on it. The more people looking at code, the better, to keep them honest. But it is designed in a way to be end-to-end encrypted. So the idea there is, between the combination of end-to-end encryption and the fact that it's open source and you can verify it, it means that you don't have to trust the company that's running the servers with the contents of that message. which I think is a very important distinction. I mean, obviously there could be certain things that happen there, but that's like the base standard that I think we want to see in all of our tools and services, that they're designed in a way to reduce trust in the overarching company as much as possible. And then they're open, the code's open so that we can actually prove and verify that.
Do you keep in mind though, like,
yeah, go on.
To actually like do that entire proof to yourself too, like you'll need to either build it yourself or, you know, like PGP verify your download and everything and not get the automatic updates and all that stuff, which is a huge barrier for entry to a lot of people that likely aren't doing that, which is another
there's
thing.
trade-offs everywhere, right?
Yeah.
But I think as a base standard, if that's the expectation, ideally you have some people that are doing it, right? So at least, you know, users might get fucked, but at least the alarm will be sound, you know, like it might be after the fact, it might be too late for someone. They've already lost their privacy, or in the case of malicious Bitcoin software, maybe lost their coins, but at least it would be known, right?
Yeah, that's true.
Like, it's strictly better than if you compare it to something that's closed and not end-to-end encrypted.
Oh yeah, 100%.
Before we got on that Keybase tangent, Janine, you were saying something pretty interesting. You had it. I was enjoying where we were going with that. I guess we were talking about personal servers, and the convenience trade-off that entails.
Yeah, I think the last thing I said before I went to the Keybase question was about how I think the intermediary step will just be having, you know, a more localized kind of community-run thing where you know the person who is self-hosting the infrastructure, and maybe they're the skilled one who knows how to handle that, and they can, you know, an individual or a group of people who know what to do can host for their local community or their friends. Maybe they're not living near each other physically, but I feel like that's the intermediary step, because at the end of the day, most people, whether it's because they don't have the money to build up the infrastructure or the knowledge to know how to do that properly, most people are not going to do that. So I feel like at least the intermediary step is going to be just, you know, a group of friends or some families who know each other to do that together.
The Uncle Jim model.
Yeah, the freaks know the model very well.
I think it's a good starting place too, because like, for some people, like getting a whole server rack is like, you know, it's completely untenable. Like if you asked like my mom to do that, she'd, you know, just be like, I'm never doing this. So it is a good thing, like if you do have that, you know, the quote unquote Uncle Jim to be able to set something up, and like, you know, our hardware is getting cheaper and cheaper. Like you can get a Raspberry Pi like 3 for like $20 or something. So like it could be doable, and like it's not exorbitantly expensive, where it's not like, you know, you're keeping a barrier to entry from like a lot of the like poorer parts of the world. But we do need to actually build that software. I don't know. At least personally, I don't know any messaging that is like self-hosted, like the Uncle Jim model kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I've been kind of bullish on the Uncle Jim concept, but when I talked to a lot of old timers, they were like, that's kind of what, you know, everyone was always saying, and then it just turned into the cloud model. So I don't know if we're just like in our little bubble, but I think that that's kind of what we should try to achieve, because I mean, as Janine said, like I don't think we can really expect that many people at scale. I mean, let's look at Bitcoin nodes, right, which has like a massive incentive to use your own node, right, and very low burden. Even with that, we don't see many people running that or using their own node. I mean, what do we think the upper end of that is? Max like 100,000 people.
Yeah, I think around there is probably right. Like, and you know, like you said, it's a huge incentive where, you know, you could lose like potentially like thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars if you're not running your own node. So it is kind of bearish for the home node thing. But I mean, if you do build like something or like something that people actually really want, you could like get people over there. But I mean, we need to actually build that, which hopefully someone does.
But overall, ultimately, that's where we want to go. We want to go to easy self-hosting, make it as easy and accessible as possible, and allow people to basically operate as like a localized cloud, if you will, for either their neighborhoods or their friends and family. And then all of a sudden, you have a way more distributed model that is more censorship resistant. So that would be absolutely fantastic to see. And that's what I've been dedicating like a lot of my time to is these, sovereignty boxes, if you will. But I mean, on top of that, I mean, you still have major infrastructure issues that even if you have the self-hosted box in people's homes, I mean, we just go right back to the Tor conversation, right? And then you're relying on Tor actually working. Otherwise, like you can't make that future doesn't happen without Tor as it stands right now. It's fully reliant on Tor, or hopefully we have either Tor 2.0 or a new protocol in place. But right now, as it stands, we need Tor for it, right?
Also, like you get back to like your very first conversation, you get back to like the app stores could censor you if you wanted to like make it usable from the phone, unless you like sideload the app onto your phone, which you're not gonna be able to get the normie to do. So like you still have another centralization.
But see, this is where like I feel like we get ourselves into holes. Like here we are, an hour and a half into the conversation, right? And we've talked about all these more intimate things or these more sophisticated things, and ultimately the sheer fact that you can sideload an app on an Android phone is a massive improvement over something like iPhone, right? And how many people have actually sideloaded an app or needed to, right? There's just like it's just a lot of nuance. There's nuance everywhere.
Yeah. Exactly.
So I have a question from a freak in the comments, Peloponnesian. Shout out to you. Number one privacy book to read from both of you. Start with Janine.
I can go first. So it's really hard for me to say which is the number one book. So I'm just going to go with one that I think is really good and kind of undervalued, which is a book called The Maximum Surveillance Society, The Rise of CCTV by Clive Norris and Gary Armstrong. It was written long ago enough that it's actually, I think it was 1999, that it's actually available on the Internet Archive, which you can loan from. They have a digital book lending program. So if you want to read it, it is freely available. But I recommend that one because it was written, in the relatively early days of the internet. And I think it has a lot of good points about, privacy at a point where, we were really considering it from so much the apps and services and such. We were thinking, or at least he was thinking about it from the standpoint of just cameras everywhere, which is, I mean, the classic image of surveillance is a camera. And I guess that was the starting point for much bigger things where we're now putting we're doing 1984 all on our own by putting the cameras and microphones in our own houses of our free will.
I would recommend No Place to Hide by Glenn Greenwald. It's about Glenn Greenwald's the guy that broke the story about Edward Snowden, the NSA, and all that stuff. And it gets really into like how perverse like the US's surveillance state has really become, and talks about like why this could happen and how they do this. And it's a really good read, and it's pressing for the current times, and you get to learn all about Snowden.
Yeah, on the subject of usability, there's a great story in there. If anyone doesn't know, when Snowden was trying to get in contact with Glenn Greenwald, Glenn was not really using PGP at the time. And so Snowden was like, he includes in the book the fact that, and I think Snowden also wrote about it in his book, But yeah, Glenn includes the fact that like he frustrated his source by not using PGP.
I mean, like PGP is like a perfect example of the trade-off balance we were talking about earlier, right? Is because PGP has been around for a long time. I mean, and if used properly, it solves private messaging. But the problem is, it's so inconvenient to use. It's so inconvenient to use, period, and it's even more inconvenient to use in a secure fashion, that it just hasn't had the kind of uptake. And then so you compare that to something like Signal, and people 100% agree that PGP is the pure one, right? But Signal's the one that probably has sent more encrypted messages than all the years of PGP combined. But I appreciate those book recommendations. I mean, the easy one is Extreme Privacy, by Michael Basil. Everyone should give that a read. That's a good one. What else do we have here? We have a couple more questions. Twitter exodus to Mastodon. What do you guys think about Mastodon?
I mean, I've been on the Bitcoin hackers Mastodon instance since at least a year, I think. I mean, I don't post too much on Twitter anyway, and usually, yeah, I mean, I haven't fully moved to Mastodon, but I definitely recommend people should go there just because, I mean, one thing, the character count's a lot bigger, so if you want to do your massive threads, that's a lot easier on Mastodon. I also cross-post my newsletter there as well.
I've been liking Mastodon a lot. Hopefully this time is different, TM, and people actually stay. But it's been good. Like it kind of feels like more like the Bitcoin hang, where we don't need to like fight with central bankers or Peter Schiff or whoever. We just hang out and share Bitcoin memes and talk about things we actually care about. But yeah, it's been good. I've been looking into like maybe setting up my own instance too, because I feel like that'd be a really fun experiment, and I hope other people try that out too.
So I mean, it's kind of interesting. I mean, I'm also over there in the Bitcoin hackers instance. Mastodon, I've been there for a couple of years. I think people look at it the wrong way. I don't think it competes with Twitter. I think these centralized platforms allow you to, like Twitter, these massive centralized platforms let you cheaply and easily broadcast out to the world, and at the cost of censorship resistance. So Mastodon's actually really interesting based on the trade-offs we've been talking about, because it kind of does sit in the middle there. Anyone can run their own instance, which is basically a node, their own server, and they can either use that themselves, or they can Uncle Jim it and they can have other people use it, right? And it's a federated model, so you can interact across those instances. So it provides some competition in a more open environment. With the ability, as Ben said, is you can just run your own instance all by yourself, and that could just be, then all of a sudden we're in the personal server model, right? So it is a pretty cool project. It should be interesting to see how it plays out. I'm kind of cautiously optimistic at all these different like open source social media derivations, and hopefully we can move away from these massive centralized platforms, because it's gotten really, really bad in that respect. Randy McMillan, yes, does mention GPG Suite on Mac did change the game in terms of using PGP. But I mean, people shouldn't use Windows, but it's a pain in the ass on Windows. It's actually pretty easy on Linux, but I mean, when people see the command line, they get scared. And I think it's important that people realize that the UX is almost as important as the actual what's going on in the tech in the background. You need, because with privacy, it's just so easy to shoot yourself in the foot, especially. So if a tool is set up in a way where it's possible for a user to shoot themselves in the foot, you got to assume that most users are going to do it.
Yeah,
yeah,
definitely.
so sorry about that. Yeah, so I mean, I just want to thank you guys for joining the conversation. I respect both of you a lot, and that's why I asked you here for the 4th episode of this new show. Sorry it got off a little bit slow here. You know, I'm still trying to get used to this format, especially in a cabin in the woods when my internet is. We were talking about intermittent connections earlier. Yeah, that's what I'm experiencing. And I wanted to thank the freaks for joining us again, especially the freaks that are joining us live, but also to all the freaks that are going to listen to this after the fact. We're going to have another episode of Citadel Dispatch next week, same time, 5 p.m. 5 p.m. Eastern Time, 2200 UTC on Tuesday. We're going to have Rabbit Hole Recap on Thursday at 5 p.m., I believe. Also going to be a live show. So definitely show up for both of those. We'd love to have you. Janine, Ben, I appreciate you guys a ton. I'm going to throw up for our viewers. I'm going to throw up your Twitter tags. Those are also their tags on Mastodon at J9Roem and at benthecarman. Thank you guys for joining us.
Thank you. It was fun to be here.
Thank you.
I'll start from the beginning.
In your eyes, it blinds. So be careful where you look for love. Just be careful where you look for love. You can stop it.
Love you, freaks. Stay humble, stack sats.